皆さんこんにちは。Welcome back to my channel. Today, we are finally doing one of the biggest Japanese mysteries for beginner. Wa versus ga. And don't worry, it's not going to be a scary grammar lesson. I'm going to explain it in simple, real-life way, so you can actually use it when you speak. So grab your notebook and let's get started. Okay, now let's break it down with real-life examples. First, particle wa. Quick pronunciation tip. This is usually we pronounce as ha, ha. But when it's used as a particle, we pronounce it wa, wa. Now, particle wa is used when you want to set the topic. It's like you are saying, I'm talking about this thing. Let's look at some examples. 今年の夏は日本に行く予定なんだ。今年の夏は日本に行く予定なんだ。In this sentence, 今年の夏 this summer is the topic. Let's look at another one. 和食は健康的だね。和食は健康的だね。Here, the topic is 和食 Japanese food. I'm talking about 和食 in general. 私の彼氏は先生です。私の彼氏は先生です。Topic is 私の彼氏 my boyfriend. I'm introducing what I'm talking about and then giving information about it. Next, another big use of particle wa is contrast. Particle wa often leaves comparison feel like A is true but B is different. Let's look at this example. 日本は好き。日本は好き。This sentence can sound like you are leaving room for contrast, even if you don't say it. Like, Japan, I like, but maybe something else, not so much. And if you want to make that contrast crystal clear, you can say, 日本は好きだけど、日本の夏は嫌い。日本は好きだけど、日本の夏は嫌い。Here, you are contrasting two Japan-related topics. Japan overall versus Japan's summer. Another example. 東京は行ったことあるけど、京都は行ったことない。東京は行ったことあるけど、京都は行ったことない。東京 yes. 京都 no. This contrast is exactly what particle wa is used for. Particle wa is also super common in question when you pick a topic and then ask about it. For example, お酒は飲む？お酒は飲む？ Here, particle wa is like choosing the topic first. Here, as for alcohol. And then asking the question. And you can do the exact same thing with other topics like 稽古はアニメ好き？稽古はアニメ好き？最近仕事は順調？最近仕事は順調？ Alright, now let's go to particle ga. Particle ga is used when you're introducing new information, something you just notice, discover, or something happening right now. Let's look at this example. 雨が降ってきた。雨が降ってきた。電車が来ない。電車が来ない。In these moments, you are not setting up a topic like as for rain, as for train. You are reacting to new information. So particle が is correct choice. Next, particle が is also used when you want to point something out or identify something like this is the one. For example, ここが有名なラーメン屋さんだよ。ここが有名なラーメン屋さんだよ。あちらにいる方が私の上司です。あちらにいる方が私の上司です。And you will hear particle が all the time in who or what questions, both when you ask and when you answer. For example, これ誰が作ったの？私が作ったよ。これ誰が作ったの？私が作ったよ。Here, particle が is like me. I'm the one. There is one more area where you will hear particle が constantly in real-life Japanese. Ability, wants, and likes. Did parents naturally use particle が in real-life Japanese? Let's listen. 日本語が話せる。日本語が話せる。寿司が好き。寿司が好き。ビールが飲みたい。ビールが飲みたい。Let's recap today's lesson. If you are setting a topic, speaking generally, or contrasting things, use particle wa. If you are introducing new info, identify something, answering who or what, or using patterns like can, want, like, use particle ga. That's it for today's lesson. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for the next video. I love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment down below and let me know what you like to see in my future videos. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for upcoming videos. ではまた。